Hello, everyone. This is Charles Rayburn. I'm a Senior Manager of Customer Success here at ServiceNow. Thank you all so much for attending the office hour number 43 platform Flow Designer, What's New in Rome. So if you're here to hear about all the good stuff that's in Rome for Flow Designer, you come to the right place. We have our awesome senior subject matter expert, Brian Bimschlager, who will be able to talk us through the topic at hand. So remember, the first 30 minutes is all about what is the best practices, overviews, etc., related to the topic. The topic is Flow Designer. He may show some demonstrations. He may talk about all sorts of great things. The remaining 30 minutes is all about questions from you as customers. So without further ado, Brian, take it away.
All right. Thank you, Charles. So yeah, as you mentioned, I am the PM for Flow Designer, as well as one of our other automation tools at ServiceNow, Process Automation Designer. And with me on the call today is another PM on our team, Sebastian Ramirez, who is on Flow Designer as well. So you can already kind of sense the importance that we place on Flow Designer internally as a company, because we're staffing appropriately on the product side. So a lot of thinking and a lot of teams go into improving what is, the backbone of how stuff gets automated in ServiceNow. So this presentation, it's generally a roadmap of what has been accomplished for Flow Designer over the past couple releases, but I know we're targeting specifically on Rome. So admittedly, I don't know what release everybody is on, so I'm happy to give the brief overview of Paris and Quebec as well. Or Charles, if you think it's more appropriate, I can jump straight into what is coming in Rome.
Ooh, I'd almost poll the audience. If you guys want to hear about Paris and Quebec, go ahead and just raise your hand or do like a thumbs up inside your reactions there. If you guys want to just focus on Rome, which is what we have for today, that'd be great as well. Oh, Rome already popped through. Thank you, Jose. So I'm going to let Jose then have the final say. Let's go through Rome, and then if there's any questions, we can go over the other items as well.
Yeah, sure thing. So hold on, we're about to go into warp speed as we progress to Rome. So all right. So in Rome, Rome is a super exciting release for us here on the Flow Designer team, because it's given us the ability to deliver to our customers one of the most requested things that we hear in customer calls, office hours, in community sessions, in sales calls with customers. And that is, how do we solve for error handling within Flow Designer? It's been a noticeable gap in our product since it came out in Kingston, London, whenever that was, 8-9 releases ago. And there have certainly been workarounds for it. There's been, design patterns. People have come up with their own custom script solutions to add in to Flow Designer, but Flow Designer is a mature product now, and as a result, this type of functionality of handling things when they go wrong is sort of expected by our customers now. So during the Rome release, we put a lot of thought into it. We can handle errors at the flow level. So almost like kind of a macro level. We'll show slides and demos for these. But we can also zoom in if you're very technical or building custom actions, and we can handle errors within the action themselves. And then finally, we placed a big emphasis on performance, specifically within the UI. So flows load faster, especially larger flows. And once you click on actions or try and edit any content within flows, you're going to see that edit experience pop up and allow you to use it much faster. We've seen lots and lots of use cases and support tasks come in about the amount of time it takes to do things in Flow Designer. And after a bunch of research, bunch of investigation, we found a lot of those times large flows tend to be the culprit. So we're kind of discovering that we allow a good amount of flexibility within the tool, and customers will build out really awesome, very complex, comprehensive flows. And if you're using large flows to run your business, you shouldn't have to wait several minutes to open one of them. So let's dig into error handling, because we think it's pretty cool. So at a top level, this is how error handling will look within Flow Designer. I'm assuming you can see my mouse cursor, correct?
Yes.
Cool. All right. So one of the first things that you'll notice is we keep the traditional layout for Flow Designer, this top-down trigger action-based approach. But now we have an error handler section at the bottom that you can optionally enable or disable. By default, this comes disabled. So any flows that you upgrade from, either you're leaping from Paris to Quebec, or you're upgrading, or from Paris to Rome, or you're simply upgrading from Quebec to Rome, all of your flows are still going to work the exact same, which was kind of an intentional pattern to save you from a few headaches. But if you want, you can enable this error handler section, and now you've effectively added a bucket at the end of your flow that gets triggered whenever something goes wrong inside your flow. It's kind of like almost like a last resort option. So if any action fails on step 1, 2, or 3, then you will jump into the error handler, and these actions in the error handler will run just like they were actions above. We went through a pretty good effort to make sure that the user experience of the error handler section 100% mirrored all your existing patterns on how you add content to a section, how you move it around, how you annotate, things like that. And it's pretty cool, because if, let's say, your action fails on step 1, it would jump to this error handler section, and your flow could actually continue to go, and it would technically be in a kind of a pseudo success state at the end. Now, after talking with our customers and during our initial research on this, the use cases that came to mind immediately were customers wanting to add notifications or send an email in the error handler section. So admins or flow authors or whoever created a service catalog request could be notified as soon as the flow errored out. So we don't need to wait to go look for errors. We could be notified immediately. Another use case that has been pretty common is remediation of some kind. So users might want to add in a subflow into their error handler that perhaps attempts to rerun a flow, or perhaps attempts to correct some of the data that may be incorrect within the flow data. It's pretty nifty. And of course, just like you can above in the actions area, you are fully capable of adding logic within the error handler section as well. That comes into play in an interesting way, because one of the core principles that we have with error handling, and you can see in this data panel on the right-hand side, is that each action now has a status associated with it. So every single action that runs in the platform, whether it's, or that runs in Flow Designer, whether it's out of the box or it's custom, is going to always return a status code and a status message. For things that are successful, the status code will always be 0 and the message will just say success. But if an action fails, whatever generated that message, maybe you're making a call to an external system, you're making a call to post a Slack message, and the Slack server returned a 400 error, 500 error, something like that, with a very specific message. That error message would would get added to your action, and you could pass it into your error handler. So in this example, let's say step 1 fails. It generates a error code of 1 with a message of Slack server didn't respond. Suddenly your error handler section is populated with that same info, and you can use that info within your error handler section. So you could route a flow to say, hey, if my error handler gets triggered and the code is X, I wanted to do this particular action. But if the code is Y, I want to do something else. Now, if we want to zoom in even more, then we have the ability to have error handling within Action Designer as well. So this flow designer experience, it's much more geared towards perhaps your business analyst or your low code user who just wants to catch anything that goes wrong and perhaps have a comprehensive solution. Now we're in Action Designer, and this is really geared towards your application developers, the people who are building custom actions and perhaps authoring script within their steps. We added on each step within Action Designer, we add this new section called if this step fails. So when your custom action is running, for each step, you can define what you want your action to do if that step fails. You can say, hey, don't worry about it. We're just going to swallow the error and we're going to move on to the next step. Or we can say, all right, we're going to stop this action and we're going to jump to this section called error evaluation, which we'll get to next. This is a pretty powerful control, because if you might have a non-critical step in your action where your action could continue without issue. And now there's an easy way to author that. Now, error evaluation is it's very powerful. If you are so inclined to really get into the nitty-gritty and manual definition of how you want your action to end up in terms of a success or error state. So the way to think about error evaluation is, this is going to be the last thing that happens now for every action, every custom action, every out-of-the-box action. So in this example, we have a lookup record step. Doesn't matter if lookup record step fails or succeeds, error evaluation will always be the last part that runs. Now, what's cool with error evaluation is you can manually define or override what the status code and status message for your action are going to be. So by default, this section will inherit whatever the most recent status code and status message of your action, or of the most recent step is. So by default, if I don't do anything here, whatever the status code and status message of lookup records is, will be the status code and status message of my action. But if I wanted to, similar to how an if statement works or other conditions within the platform, I could set rules and say, hey, if if I look up my lookup record step, if the count is 0, I could grab this count pill. If the count is 0, then I actually want to set my action to fail, and I can provide a custom message there. Now, if this is like a little bit abstract, we have a demo that will walk us through it step by step. But at least in terms of our error handling solution, in Rome, we approached it really from 3 levels again. One is the top level. If anything goes wrong, I want to catch that error regardless of what it is and do something with it. Then we zoom into Action Designer, and if something goes wrong on a step, we can choose to stop the action or just to continue. And then once we get to the end of our action, we can manually decide or conditionally decide if we want to set our action to success or fail, and what the code and message are. So varying levels of control depending on how much control you want. We think it's pretty cool. We have a lot of positive response from users who have upgraded to Roam in early access and general availability. Now, if you'd like, we can jump into a demo. Does that sound good, Charles?
That sounds perfect.
Cool. Allow me a moment to switch the screen shares so I can get an instance up. Just a couple seconds.
Great, no worries. While Brian's doing that, any questions so far from the crowd? Anyone have anything that you want him to kind of clarify a little bit further, or just anxious to watch the demo? Yep, demo, perfect. And definitely, if you have any questions, feel free to put them into the chat window, and I'll try to ask Brian to just pause a little quick to kind of ask that question for you guys. Or if you guys want to take yourself out of a mute, you can do that as well.
All right, we are back up and running. I'm assuming you can see the error handling demo for Flow Designer, right?
Yes.
All right. So here it is, Flow Designer in all its glory. First thing that you can see is we now have this error handler toggle at the bottom. If you click to turn it on, you get the ability to add things into the error handling section, just like you normally would. Same action, logic, and subflow controls that you can expect if you were to add something in the top section. So it's very familiar in that regard. So we'll walk through a couple different instances of this this exact flow here, so we can see how error handling kind of builds incrementally. So in this example, I built a custom action that really what it's going to do is it just has some custom script just so we can force things to fail. Basically, there's going to be 3 different keywords for this action. If we type in hello, this action will return a success. If we type in error, it will be an error. And if it's recover, it will also be an error, but we'll deal with that a little bit later. So our input is hello. Let's test it out. All right, so our flow finishes running. And because this was successful, our custom action did not result in an error. We can see that our status is a code of 0 with a message of success. Like I mentioned during the slides, every action now gets appended with a status object that will have this code and message. So in this example, hey, everything worked out like we planned. There was both actions were completed and there was no need for an error handler. But I'm assuming for all of you folks, since you're on this call today, you're active users of Flow Designer, and you certainly have realized at some point that not everything goes according to plan always. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to turn on our error handler. Well, actually, we'll show that what it looks like first. If we fail our action here. So one of the problems with errors in Flow Designer is it sets your whole flow to an error, and there's not really anything you can do with it. There's no options to get it going again. It's kind of hard to figure out what the error was. There's no notifications necessarily that something happened. It's just like, hey, something went wrong, and there's not a lot you can do about it. And that's honestly not good. So what we can see here is we can see that our log step wasn't run because we had an error in the first step. So, and we can see our error message is custom error in the first step. It's because in my script step here, if the input word is error, I am defining what my error message is. Because this is my error message on this step, that gets passed up to my action status message as well. All right, so let's see what it's like as soon as we add on this error handler section. And we'll add a log here and say error message was, and now I'm going to go to my error handler pill picker, and I'm just going to grab this pill that is dynamic, and effectively this is whatever the error message was when this error handler got triggered. That's what I'm going to include in my in this log message right here. So it could be whatever, it could be an error that's generated from step 1, could be an error message generated from step 2. So as we test this out, our step 1 is still going to fail because it still has error in the as the input. But what's interesting here is our state for our flow has changed. Our flow is no longer in an error state. It's technically completed, but we also indicate that we caught an error. So something went wrong, but our error handler worked, and we were able to complete the flow. If we dig in, this is the same error message that we had before, custom error in the first step. We can see that our log is not run. But when we go into our error handler and click on our log, we see this. Our error message was error, custom error in the first step. So we're able to use that value that we generate as our error message in step 1, and we're able to access that and display that in our error handler. So pretty powerful. Now, let's say, so that's kind of the basics of how to add an error handler at the top level and how to use our error handler values or whatever values were generated as our status code and status message within the error handler section. Now, let's say we want to go a little bit deeper, right? We are in our error handler custom action step, or error handler custom error handling action. Now, in this example, what we are going to do is say, hey, if the word that we input is recover, we're also going to throw an error, and we're going to stop the action and go to error evaluation, just like we did before. So let's check this out. All right. So one of the things that we're going to see here is that, hey, that's weird. We had a custom script step that was going to throw an error, but in our kind of execution view, our operation view, it shows as completed. It's a little bit weird. What's going on there? Well, in our error evaluation section, we made a rule here that says if the word that we are accepting as an input for our action is recover, I'm going to manually override whatever the status code and status message is that preceded this. And I'm going to say, regardless if it's an error or not, we're not going to treat it as one. And I'm going to manually set my status code to 0, and I'm going to override my status message to this custom message. Now, this is pretty handy. So if you know that, let's say, for example, you have a step here that might be like a REST step. You're trying to connect to some external system to get some information, right? Well, maybe you only want that step to be successful if you receive a payload that's not empty. You're looking for a list of users, and the rest of your action is really only valuable if you actually get more than 0 users back. A real use case is you could say, hey, I want to look in my script step and this object, and I get the list of users. And if it's blank, then I want to fail my step. Even if it was technically successful, it correctly returned me no information. I could define no information as criteria to error my action. So it's pretty powerful in a combination of ways. Manually setting an error as a success, or vice versa, manually setting a success as an error. Now, where this gets really powerful, and this admittedly solved a big need for our internal developers when we create out-of-the-box actions. You can add as many of these error conditions as you want. So if you are deep into the weeds building custom actions, and you know every which way that this action that communicates with some custom web service, you know every possible status code that's going to be thrown at you and how this can fail in every single way. You could, if you wanted to, go in and say, hey, if the code is 300, I want to give this message. If the code's 400, I want to give this message. If it's 500, I want to give this message. A lot of customization and configurability to the depth of whatever you want. And these actions will evaluate top down. So this, if the word is recover, is going to be the first one that evaluates. But if I author some different error message or evaluation condition, I could drag and drop. So my new one gets evaluated first. All right, so to recap, we've demoed error handling in the sense where we can enable this error handler section. We've shown how we can use the status code and status message from the action that failed within our error handler section. Within our action designer, we've talked about how you can manually control what happens if this action fails or this step fails. And then finally, we talked about customizable conditions in error evaluation. So you can manually override the status code and status message for your actions. There's a lot there and a lot of varying levels of depth. That is the end of the demo, but I'm going to operate under the assumption that there are going to be a few questions here. So feel free to ask away in the chat or unmute and ask via voice as well.
All right. Thank you there, Brian. I just asked for any of you to unmute if you have any questions based upon the demo. Oh, go ahead, Jose. If you want to unmute and go ahead and ask your question, that'd be great.
Sure. So for our production instance, we tend to give flow operator for those who have who are leveraging flow designer so they can see the execution of their flows. So is it safe to assume that these error messages that they can build will also be visible through their flow operator role?
Yeah, absolutely. Now, we treat the error messages just as any other piece of data from an action. So, it's really no different than like a trigger having a data pill or some other action having data pills available. Those action messages are treated the exact same way. So, from a data perspective, if your flow operator role can see the outputs of actions in Flow Designer, they'd be able to see the error message outputs as well. We do have some interesting things coming in San Diego as well regarding error handling, where we can, based on the role that a user has, we can enable or disable the error handler section, or enable or disable some of the advanced error handling functionality within Action Designer as well. So if you are, it sounds like you're already exploring different roles for different functionality in your production instances. More control over error handling is coming in San Diego for those types of situations.
Great. Okay, that answered Jose's question. Any other questions from the audience out there? I did also too launch the live office hour poll. Please fill that out before you head out. Any questions for Brian? And this can go from, I'm assuming, Rome, but also too, were there any highlights, Brian, that you wanted to share related to Quebec? Not necessarily Paris, but Quebec from a flow designer perspective.
Yeah. So one moment.
And while you do that, there was another question from Jose. Any future release info that can be shared on Flow Designer? So anything that's forward thinking that you feel is okay, and obviously, definitely before you do, throw up that safe harbor.
Yeah, it's good question, and we have some cool stuff that I can show for Quebec, but I'll show it in slide format. But definitely for San Diego, we can give you kind of a peek as well as to what's coming.
Oh, that'll be great for both.
All right. So screen sharing just failed to start for me. Give me a moment. All right. So within Quebec, one of our big initiatives was to make Flow Designer easier to use for our citizen developers. So I know we have a lot of software developers, application developers, potentially admins on the call today. One of our initiatives at ServiceNow is making it easier for Flow Designer to be used by people who have less technical aptitude. And I think by doing that, it makes the overall product a little bit easier to use as well. So we had three big things in Quebec, as well as a couple of other items that really filled out the release. So first is a UI redesign. We had a big initiative in ServiceNow to release a new product called App Engine Studio, which is really kind of a one-stop shop for building custom apps in a low-code environment. Flow Designer was included in the first release of App Engine Studio, and because of that, we did a whole facelift on the entire product to make everything feel much more modern, a little bit more fresh. Now, the next thing that we did was a big ask from customers as well, which was flow variables. If you've used our workflow product before, you're familiar with the concept of the workflow scratchpad, where you can define variables on the fly and assign their value to be whatever you want. You can modify that value whenever you want. We're doing the same thing in Quebec with flow variables. And it's been a big hit, as you don't need to rely on some previously created table or record to hold all your info. You can just author stuff on the fly. So here's an example of how flow variables works. We would add that variable just as an action in your flow. So just like you can set the outputs of a subflow, here we can set the value for a flow variable that you previously defined elsewhere within Flow Designer. It makes it really easy to update and modify those values on the fly. Now, this is, I acknowledge that the UI is not pretty here, but this is a feature called feature access control. And in combination with some work that we did in the Paris release, we have really powerful control over which user roles can access what content and which features within Flow Designer. Jose, you mentioned before, you have some users with a flow operator role in a production environment. If you wanted to, with this feature access control, you could go in and manually define, hey, our users with our flow operator role, they can, you could define which features were available to them. So if they also had Flow Designer and were able to build flows, you could say, if they have a flow operator role, I want to show them the test button and the save button, but I don't want to make activate or deactivate visible to them. Additionally, you could apply content rules to that as well. So I have HR admin. That is a role, and HR is building out some flows. I could create some rules to say, hey, anyone with the HR admin role, they can access this small subset of actions or logic. So from an admin perspective, you can create like a more safe and secure authoring environment.
Awesome. 2 thumbs up there for those answers. Thank you so much, Brian. Well, everyone, just to remind you, I launched a live office poll, so go ahead and fill that out before you leave. Are there any other questions, comments, or concerns? Great session. Thanks there, Bryce. All right, for those who are listening to the video recording, thank you guys so much for tuning in. If there's any other questions you guys may have, just go ahead and post that into the community site once it's actually up there. We'll try to do our best to respond. Brian, as always, amazing stuff. I look forward to seeing even more stuff in the new year. Thank you all so much. Take care and have a great rest of your Friday.